Hello there. Let's talk about laptop hardware, because this is a very common type of client device you'll get in the workplace. Now, I can actually do a lot of the concepts for laptop hardware in a single sentence. Laptops generally have the same type of hardware components that you will find in desktops, the things we've spoken about in previous videos here. And generally the hardware that you find in a laptop is just the mobile equivalent of a desktop model. Now, the thing about being a mobile equivalent is it's got to be more energy efficient because laptops generally run off of a battery. And it's also got to be a lot more compact because it's got to fit in a smaller chassis. And it's also got to be more heat efficient because there's not a lot of space for cooling solutions. So that's basically laptop hardware summarized. But with that out of the way, now we can focus on things that are quite specific to dealing with laptops, like having to disassemble them if you have to upgrade or repair anything, assuming there are repairable parts on your laptop. That is changing with every passing year. Now, the disassembly process for a laptop will vary depending on the make and model of the laptop. We usually recommend that you refer to any support documentation that you can get your hands on for the process and steps to go through. Otherwise, maybe there's a video on YouTube for that specific make and model. Otherwise, just wing it and be careful. Usually, you begin with removing the screws from the underside of the laptop as your first step and getting that panel off. Thereafter, it can vary quite a bit. So to help you out, let me give you some good tips though. So first up, please use the right shape and size screwdriver bit when you're disassembling the laptop. Unlike larger screws that you would find in desktops, your laptop screws have a lot less metal. Now that means that the screw heads are more likely to be damaged if you use the wrong shape or size driver bit. Also, when you are reinserting those screws, please don't over tighten them, because first of all you run the risk of stripping or damaging the screw head when you're tightening it, or making it more likely that the next person strips and damages the screw head, which is a real pain in the backside to deal with if that occurs. The next really good bit of advice is to try and keep track of where the screws came out. There are a couple different ways you can do this, but usually a piece of paper and some tape and a pen would be a pretty good way to keep track of roughly where the screws came out, especially as not all screws are the same length or possibly even diameter. Thankfully, I'm seeing a lot more laptops stick to the same diameter but maybe have different lengths, and some are even really nicer and actually keep the screws all the same regardless of where they are on the body. But do try and keep track of where the screws came out so that when you're reinserting the screws during reassembly, you don't run out or, worse yet, have left over. Then once screws are out of the way, the next thing you have to deal with are plastic clips. Whether those plastic clips keep the casing together or are the clips that keep cable connectors attached to the laptop's motherboard or system board, whichever term you prefer. Please be gentle with those plastic clips. They are fragile and they get more delicate as the plastic gets older. So try not to apply too much force if you can avoid it. Rather, whenever you're dealing with laptops, apply as little force as you think you can get away with, and then gently increase the amount of force you're applying until you get a clip to unlatch. And this advice goes doubly true for, for example, the flexible ribbon cables that connect things like the touchpad and the keyboard and whatever else to the laptop's motherboard. And you know what? You've got a phone with a camera in your pocket more than likely. So take some photos to keep track of things as you're working through it so that you can reverse the photos and the steps you went through when you're reassembling. I used to do this years ago when my phone's cameras even weren't as good as they are now. And this was always a helpful thing. Although I didn't always have the great detail, it did make my life a little bit easier, especially when I was dealing with a laptop that I wasn't used to or familiar with. And overall, slow is smooth, smooth is fast. I'm not claiming ownership to that saying, but it is pretty true when it comes to working with laptop disassembly. Don't rush it. Slow is a smooth process, and smooth ultimately ends up fast because you don't stuff up and have to fix mistakes and problems you've caused for yourself. It's actually really good advice in many things when it comes to IT and hardware support, but really follow that advice with laptops. Now, laptop power issues are a pretty common thing to deal with. So let's understand how laptop power works. You obviously have your AC adapter that plugs into the wall socket for mains power. It's often referred to as the charging cable. Whichever term you use, I'm happy as long as we all know what we're talking about. And its job is to provide the appropriate voltage and current for optimal charging of the laptop battery. They also usually have a DC barrel connector that is unique to that laptop, or at least that model, to ensure that you don't accidentally use the wrong charger, possibly using the wrong voltage, more than likely the wrong charging current that could lead to damage to the laptop's battery. This is one of the reasons why I normally advise, if you ever need to get another charging cable, preferably get the correct one from the laptop vendor. Otherwise, get an aftermarket spare from an authorized, trusted reseller or spare manufacturer. Avoid those universal chargers, because anything that's universal about them is the ability to get a variety of DC barrel adapters to cater for different sockets on laptops. Universal chargers and pirate chargers very rarely provide the correct current, and that can be a danger to the battery. So let's talk a bit about the battery. Most laptop batteries nowadays are either lithium-ion or lithium polymer batteries, mainly because lithium-based power cells are able to store quite a lot of electrical charge and run for a really long time, compared to older battery technology that you used to get in ancient laptops. And you get two main types of laptop batteries. Hard shell batteries, some people call them external batteries, and they look a little bit like this. They are usually part of the bottom side of the laptop's casing, and some little plastic clips that you can access from the outside can be used to unlatch and remove this battery. But then you get soft shell batteries, or internal batteries, that are basically these little black pillow-like pads that are inside the laptop body. We call them soft cell because it hasn't got a hard plastic enclosure protecting the lithium-ion or lithium polymer batteries on the inside. This means that they are vulnerable to puncture damage, and that could be very dangerous with lithium-based power. So be very careful once you've got these batteries exposed. And we normally encourage that you disconnect the battery as soon as you can when working inside the laptop. With the hard shell or external batteries that you can easily remove before you even get your screwdrivers out, that's great, guarantees safety. But with the internal batteries, you have to get the laptop open before you can get to this little connector over here and remove it from the system board. But that should be one of your first steps as soon as you can get to that thing. Just be very careful when you remove it so you don't damage any parts of the plastic connector or possibly dislodge any of the wires in the connector. And maybe take a photo just to make sure that you put it back in the right order. Because almost every laptop battery I've seen internally will have some color-coded wires, so if you can keep track of which colors were on which side, it'll make your life easier plugging in the right way around. Then you get your laptop storage. Laptops will have at least one option or space for a drive connector inside, but multiple connectors are possible depending on the laptop manufacturer. For example, you might get a 2.5-inch SATA connector and an M.2 connector possibly. Now the 2.5-inch hard disk drives or SATA SSDs are your laptop class or size of internal drives. With 2.5-inch HDDs or 2.5-inch spinning disks, they are not as reliable or as high performance as a 3.5-inch disk you get in a desktop. But in fairness, you are miniaturizing moving parts so that it can fit in a laptop. But when you're looking at a SATA SSD, that's a 2.5-inch form factor, doesn't matter whether it's for a laptop or a desktop, the internals are the same. So performance-wise, a SATA SSD in a desktop or a laptop behaves the same despite being 2.5-inch. In fact, depending on the drive's capacity, a lot of the internal space might be empty. Because when you're starting to look at like 256 to 512 gigs worth of SSD storage, you don't need that much circuit board or memory chips to store the data. And then if you're using an M.2 form factor SSD, usually an NVMe SSD as people know it, those are, again, really nice from a performance perspective. And the same whether you're plugging them into a laptop or a desktop. Just do yourself a favor and try and match the PCIe generation for the NVMe SSD, because you'll at the very least be wasting money on performance or leaving performance on the table depending on which you must match, or possibly even running into a compatibility issue if you skip a generation. So just check the laptop's details. Now, usually the reason why you care so much about laptop storage is either having more capacity or more performance is a common driving factor for people to get either a drive upgrade or replace their existing drives. Now, when you have to do an upgrade or replacement, there's a process you want to go through. You obviously want to make sure that the user doesn't lose their data, especially if they have one of those laptops that only gives you one option for an internal drive, not multiple. So you could either do something called drive cloning, where the drive that you buy either comes with cloning software that you can download and use, or you go and find a third-party product that lets you basically recreate the original hard drive or SSD on the new one. Cool, great. Basically, everything's exactly the same as it was in the old one. Carry on, please. Or alternatively, and my personal favorite, back up the important data files and do a fresh installation. I love a fresh installation of an operating system. It's an opportunity just to get rid of any weird bugs and quirks from the previous one and just make some better choices and decisions next time round. In fact, it's normally recommended that once in a while you do reinstall an operating system just to sort out weird problems that occur in the long term. But assuming good practices and good configuration management, you can probably make a single OS installation image last a really long time. I've managed to get many years out of modern operating systems without ever thinking about reinstalling them, mainly because I know what to do and what not to do from personal experience, at least for what I need out of a computer. Now, speaking of data, the next thing that you're interested in data-wise is laptop's memory or RAM. Laptop RAM comes in its own unique form factor called Small Outline Dual Inline Memory Module, or SODIMM. And they look a little bit like this. Now, similar to desktops, we nowadays use the DDR level number to help us deal with physical compatibility. So, for example, if I'm looking at my laptop and it takes DDR4 SODIMM modules, DDR3 and DDR5 will not fit in to the socket. It's just a different pin out, slightly different size, and that little notch tooth system that's on the memory / connector in the laptop is in a different position for each generation. So you won't be able to get the wrong generation of RAM in, no matter how many times you flip that RAM around. So it's awesome that the DDR level helps deal with our physical compatibility issues as well. I remember a time we actually had to memorize the dimensions and the pinouts for memory compatibility for both desktops and laptops. Trust me, it's way nicer nowadays than it used to be. But be aware of a growing trend. Some laptops are coming with soldered RAM. In other words, the RAM is permanently soldered into the motherboard, just like the CPU is. This is done as a cost-saving measure, and, in fairness, it does actually improve performance. Soldering two devices together gives a better electrical connection between those two devices than physical contact does, even though we're using gold plates on those pins. Solder gives a better connection, which means you're going to have better performance, less issues, and be able to achieve higher clock speeds and data transfer rates. The downside is when the soldered RAM fails, you pretty much either need to get an entire new motherboard, and when you start looking at that, you're probably not that far away from the price for an entirely new laptop, which can be super irritating. So just be prepared for that trend right now. It is growing at the moment. But as always, we do recommend you consult the laptop's documentation or the vendor's website for details on the DDR level and the max capacity of RAM that laptop can handle. You'll often find that laptops have a much lower limit in terms of max RAM capacity than desktops do. It's a function of the motherboard and just the trade-offs for miniaturizing this technology. So you could buy a desktop computer and a laptop at the exact same time with more or less the same generation of hardware. And you could probably get way more RAM capacity in the desktop's motherboard than you could off the laptop. But you know what? I'm willing to bet you can probably still get a really large amount of RAM that will serve your needs on a laptop most of the time. Then we get our laptop's keyboards, touchpads, and security peripherals, which, believe it or not, are actually serviceable, replaceable components on quite a lot of laptops. Keyboard replacement is usually a very, very viable option, as most keyboard modules are shared between multiple device models. There are some makes and models of laptop that I've dealt with in the past where the manufacturer used the exact same keyboard module for many years across all of their laptop models. From the cheapest of cheap to their top-end models, they use the exact same keyboard module. And one of the reasons why I remember this is they also made that keyboard super easy to replace. You actually didn't need to get a screwdriver out and pull out screws to get this thing out. There were these cool little hidden latches and stuff like that, which is why I previously said consult documentation for disassembly advice, because the ease of removal will vary. But thankfully, keyboards are often replaceable. You just need to find the right model number for the keyboard, find it, and then get your hands on it. The touchpad is also usually a replaceable part, and is often a common model shared by many makes and models. Yes, believe it or not, the same touchpad can be found on different manufacturer or vendors, never mind models within a single vendor's ecosystem. And again, the ease of removal does vary, but often with a touchpad you do have to get inside there because the actual touch-sensitive component is underneath a thin plastic film that is part of the laptop's casing. The thing your finger's touching is more likely part of the laptop's bodywork than the actual touchpad itself. So you're going to have to get in there to get to the actual touch-sensitive electronics. But once you're in there and replaced it, yeah, it's a replaceable, repairable part, which is good news for laptop longevity, especially in the workplace. Speaking of the workplace, you're likely to have a biometric scanner. The most common is a fingerprint scanner, but you also do get specialized facial recognition cameras popping up right now, which is kind of cool. Cameras that are able to do a little bit more than just go, yes, you look like the right person. The cameras can actually check that you're a real human being and not a very good video replay of that person. Now, these are usually replaceable components on enterprise laptops. Believe it or not, enterprise laptops are actually designed to be more serviceable and repairable than consumer laptops are. Generally because a lot of companies and businesses do value total cost of ownership. And total cost of ownership does include, well, how long does this thing last me? And what's the replacement going to cost when it comes time? The longer I can make a laptop run in the workplace, the better. Up to a point, obviously. But you'll always find that enterprise laptops are built to a different standard and are often a lot more repairable. Not going to drop any names because none of them sponsor my videos, so they're not getting free advertising from me. Now, that's enough for the basics of laptops. The internal hardware is very similar to what you get in a desktop. The Intel CPU you get in a laptop is very similar in terms of capability and features that you would get on a desktop. The trade-off is, though, to be a laptop or mobile CPU, it's got to be more compact, more energy efficient, and more thermally efficient, and usually things like performance capabilities are the trade-off for that. Nonetheless, though, I'd like to say thanks for watching. I really do appreciate it. If you have any friends, family members, colleagues, or peers that would also enjoy this, don't be afraid to share this video with them. Otherwise, though, I'll catch you in the next video.